Welcome to Troubleshooting Zen Study and Practice number 53. And this time the question is, what is heart-to-heart transmission? So this term transmission is a term that appears in Zen and obviously Chinese Chan as well. Sometimes it's referred to as mind-to-mind transmission. As I've said before, I prefer the term heart. It's the term my own late teacher used because mind does conjure up something far more cerebral, whereas heart is used rather in the same way as we refer to the heart of something or the essence of something, the very core, in other words. And the term heart to heart is used in this way. Plus, obviously, we talk about the heart. This is, of course, a translation of the term chitta, the Sanskrit term referring to the basis of consciousness itself, which we've dealt with before. Anyway, we do have this term transmission. It's something that appears in the famous verse attributed to the first patriarch of Zen, Bodhidharma, that 4-line verse that goes, a special transmission outside the teachings, not dependent on words and phrases, directly pointing to the human heart, seeing into its nature and awakening. And this verse is in itself sums up, if you like, the essence or the heart of Bodhidharma's teaching, who was the first patriarch of Zen, as already said. And so it begins with this heart-to-heart transmission, and in a way it contrasts it with the second line, not dependent on words and phrases, which unfortunately has been taken by some in sort of more contemporary interpretations wrongly to mean that the sutras and the written teachings are not important in Zen. Absolutely they are. But what Bodhidharma is saying is that what's really important, the essence of Zen, is one's own personal insight that has been verified by a qualified teacher, and that is the root thing. That, in other words, that the Buddha's own insight can't be written down, can't be found in any of the sutras, and that the sutras, the scriptures and the teachings are like fingers pointing to the moon, but not to mistake the finger for the moon itself. So Bodhidharma's verse reminds us that this is something that is really essential in the practice of Buddhism. And not to forget that Zen itself was one of a number of Chinese schools that arose around about the 5th century of the Common Era. And it sort of arose in reaction to a sort of burgeoning philosophy, which, although the philosophy was true and correct, Buddhistically speaking, it was becoming a substitute for personal insight, and therefore the Zen school produced this notion of the importance of personal insight that wasn't dependent on the written word, not dependent on sort of exoteric or extant teachings, but that was something that one had to penetrate into the heart of again. So transmission, when it comes to it, talks about this, or points to, perhaps is the best way, points towards this living tradition of personal insight for each person. And this also it became linked to authenticating the lineage, because when it comes to heart-to-heart transmission, this isn't just about having one's personal insight verified by a teacher, by a qualified teacher or Zen master. It also refers to the continuity of the lineage of the Zen tradition itself as well. And this goes back to, or the Zen school uses as its sort of founding scripture, what's known as the Flower Sermon scripture. And this is this recounts an episode later on in the Buddha's life, when the Buddha sat down to give a sermon in the usual way, and instead of speaking, he remained silent, and people began to look a bit puzzled. And then at one point, he picked a flower. In some places it said that this was a lotus, which of course, as I'm sure everybody knows, is the classic symbol of the Buddha's teaching itself. This is why statues or pictures of the Buddha, he's always seated on a lotus, because it represents the purity of the teaching. And he said he picked this flower and he twirled it, and Mahakasyapa was the only one who smiled. And the Buddha saw this and said, I give the transmission of the Dharma to Mahakasyapa. And that was the moment, that was the point where the Buddha appointed Mahakasyapa, who was his most senior Arhat disciple, as his successor. And thus Mahakasyapa became the first patriarch. The first of the Indian patriarchs, and Bodhidharma happens to be the 28th Indian patriarch, and also the first Chinese patriarch as well, because as we know in the story, he went from India to China because of persecution in India at the time. So this starts, if you like, the lineage after Buddha Shakyamuni, and of course in Zen temples, each morning that lineage is chanted. Normally it takes in the 7 Buddhas, that's the 6 previous, and Shakyamuni Buddha, our Buddha of our era, and then the patriarchs come after that, starting with Mahakasyapa and then going to Ananda, and so on and so forth. And that lineage is chanted down through the ages, through the various countries, right to the present day. And in my own lineage includes the name of my own late teacher, and that forms the whole of the lineage. And this gives authentication. And normally what happens is that it doesn't just show that a disciple has had insight into the Buddha nature, which is, if you like, the fundamental insight. It also, on top of that, not only shows that they have integrated that teaching into their own life, which is obviously a requirement for any teacher, but it is also a mark of transmission, to say that the teacher now appoints this person to be his or her successor. So in essence, that term transmission carries a range, shall we say, of meanings that have become associated with it. But still, we can have a little look and see what else this term transmission implies. Because when it comes to it, it's also, in the usual sort of paradoxical Zen way, said that the transmission, that the transmission actually is not a transmission, that in the transmission nothing is actually transmitted. So perhaps what does that mean? Well, this is something that Master Rinzai actually points to as well. Those who are familiar with Master Rinzai's, the story of his own awakening, will know that he had 3 encounters, 3 interviews with his master, who was Obaku, and each time Obaku struck him whenever Rinzai asked the question, what is the essence of Buddhism? What is the heart of Buddhism? What is the essence of Buddhism? And because he couldn't penetrate through this response from Obaku, this very direct response from Obaku, Rinzai took his leave, and Obaku instructed him that he should only go down to see Master Daigu, who lived in a temple at the foot of the mountain where Obaku's temple was on top. And so Rinzai dutifully did. And when he got there, he gained an audience with Master Daigu, who asked why he'd come and where he'd come from. And Rinzai explained that he'd come from Obaku. And Daigu said, well, why have you come here? And so Rinzai explained the 3 interviews that he had, and said that he didn't understand Obaku's teaching. At which point Daigu sort of turned on him and scolded him very fiercely, saying that he was an ingrate, that Obaku had showed grandmotherly kindness, and Rinzai had repaid that by walking out, and how dare he? At which point, after the scolding, Rinzai suddenly realized and penetrated into, awoke to, had great insight into the teaching that Obaku had been pointing at. And his response is fascinating, because his response was, well, this is Rinzai, well, after all, there's not much to Obaku's teaching. Now, this is something that normally takes place, that's normally looked into in the interview room. But for our purposes, that might seem a really strange response. And in fact, Daigu picks it up, because he says, first of all, you come here saying you don't understand his teachings. Now you disparage them by saying there's not much to them. Get out, which actually was great praise. Daigu was confirming that Rinzai had indeed penetrated through to the essence, but that he should go back to Obaku, who was his teacher. Which he did, and Obaku confirmed it as well. But it's an interesting response. Well, there's not much to Obaku's teaching after all. And this really sort of reflects something back, because, for us in the training, perhaps particularly in the early days, we're very keen, and we're also very green as well. But we are very keen to sort of, we read these stories, these strange stories of these encounters between people like Obaku and Rinzai and Daigu and so forth, and many others. And these stories intrigue us, and we read things about emptiness and interconnectedness and so forth, or transmission, Inca and so forth, and we become fascinated with these things, and we think, I just really must sort of understand these things. And perhaps if I can read another book or hear another talk, and someone can just give me it, just in the right way, then I'll understand. I'll penetrate through. I'll understand. All this, and we can become, a little bit sort of fixated on trying to sort of accumulate more and more and more of the sort of Zen teachings and the Zen philosophy and the Zen understanding and all this sort of stuff. And we can become, a little bit carried away by this and start trying to hold smart alecky conversations and so forth. I certainly remember doing it back in the beginning of my own training as well. Doesn't last very long usually. If you're under a decent teacher, that doesn't last very long. But suffice to say that, one can sort of assume an air, a sort of Zen air, and, one can spout Zen and talk about Zen and really sort of produce something quite artificial, which is really only going further away from the essence of what Zen is. As Master Rinzai says elsewhere, just be your ordinary selves. But actually being our ordinary selves is an incredibly difficult thing to do, because most of the time we're putting on a face, or we're putting on an air, as Master Rinzai puts it, and that face is not genuine. It's how I like to project myself, how I like to be seen by myself and also by others as well. And so, this is definitely something that we can get a little bit carried away with. On the other hand, Zen tends to talk about emptying out, and in the practice, we're taught to give ourselves away wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done. So this is the direct opposite, really. So when it comes to transmission, is this talking about, being filled up again by something that the master gives us? So the answer is no. No, it isn't. And this is really what Rinzai was pointing to, because at the end of the day, you cannot transmit from something from one person to another that they already have. And this is really what's being pointed to. Now, in the Mahayana, of course, it says that all beings are Buddhas already. And so if all beings are Buddhas already, then one person cannot transmit the Buddha nature if you like, to another person, because all beings already have Buddha nature. One can only wake up to or realize something that one already has, something that's already in one's possession. And perhaps the nearest sort of example that can be given for how this works, because to remember that everything that we come across is Zen, in Zen practice and in the Zen tradition, is if you like, an adaptation of a very ordinary and everyday human qualities. It can't be anything less than that, and it can't be anything more than that, really, either. As has already been said, insight can only be realizing something that already is, rather than actually getting something that we didn't have previously. And as I say, perhaps the best example of that is in poetry. So, for example, a good poet is able to evoke something in the hearer. But what is being evoked in the hearer is a human experience. And the reason that poetry works is because we're all human. And we all have common experiences, and poets write about common experiences like joy, like loss, like falling in love, because these are all things that humans do, and therefore poetry is full of this. And a good poet is able to evoke the experience, and the experience that's being evoked is the same experience or feelings that the poet, him or herself, experienced when they were inspired to write the poem in the first place. So that's why poetry doesn't work with stones, because stones don't have the same nature as human beings do, but other human beings can have that poetic state evoked in them by a good poet. So there's nothing more, there's nothing less, and there's nothing really transmitted, per se. I mean, a poem is recited, but nothing is actually transmitted from one person to another. Nothing. It's not like the poet, gives us something materially, but there's an evocation in both the heart of the poet and in the heart of the hearer, as well. And I like to I've made this point elsewhere as well, that is the truth that poets speak. So going back to what is it like to be in love? Well, you can ask a psychologist who will explain the psychology of love. You can speak to an endocrinologist who will explain about what hormones are released when people fall in love, and you can get all these descriptions of what being in love is like. But if you actually want to know what it's like for oneself in one's own being, then it's the poet that we go to, because the poet can evoke. So when we see heart-to-heart transmission, it should be seen in that way. So now, in sort of practical terms, as it goes, or historical terms, if you like, as I've said, the transmission itself is normally used to bring about, as it were, an authority or a status. So when the Buddha twirled the flower, Mahakasyapa smiled, and then the Buddha passed on the robe and bowl, as it's commonly put, transmitted to Mahakasyapa what he called the Dharma-rai, the single Dharma-rai. But that meant that he was giving Mahakasyapa the authority to be the successor to the Buddha. And then Mahakasyapa did the same to Ananda as well. And if we go and have a look at some of the early Zen literature, in particular the records of the transmission of the lamp, which has recently been translated into English by Randolph Whitfield in a number of volumes, we can see that these are all documented. These transmission stories of the patriarchs are like Mahakasyapa and Ananda and Nagarjuna and all the rest, are documented, and they often also contain what's called the transmission verse that was given to them. So according to custom and practice, the master will compose what's called a transmission verse, which is basically the heart of their teachings, the essence of their teachings, and they will give that verse to the person who is receiving that transmission. So if you like, that's the sort of outward the outward vessel, if you like, of that inner awakening that has been transmitted, quote unquote, from master to successor. So that hopefully gives a little bit of an insight into what this term actually means. It's a form of authentication. It's a form of continuing the lineage and giving authority to carry on that lineage in that name, in the name of the founder. But it also has an inward meaning as well as regards the equivalence of the Buddha nature in all beings. Okay, we'll leave that there for now. Just to remind you, if you yourself have a question that you would like answering, then please do send it to rinzai@thezengateway.com. That's Rinzai, RINZAI, @thezengateway.com. Thank you, and see you again next month.